Tens of thousands of Israelis took to the streets of Tel Aviv last night for a third night of protests. They're demanding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reach a ceasefire deal as soon as possible. The renewed push comes after Israel announced that 6 Israeli hostages were found dead, killed by Hamas last weekend. One of the sticking points in finalizing the long-awaited ceasefire deal is a small sliver of land along Gaza's border with Egypt. It's known as the Philadelphia Corridor. It holds the Rafah border crossing. Israel seized control of the corridor in May when its ground offensive pushed into Rafah. And Hamas is demanding that Israel give up control of the border as part of negotiations, but Netanyahu refuses to do so. With concerns about a ceasefire falling apart, the U.S. says talks remain constructive.
Over the coming days, the United States will continue to engage with our partners in the region to push for a final agreement. During talks last week, we made progress on dealing with the obstacles that remain, but ultimately, finalizing an agreement will require both sides to show flexibility.
So where does that leave us now? John Allen is the former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Rhonda Sleem is a senior fellow and director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute. It's good to see you both. John, Rhonda, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
John, I listened to that clip we just played, and I feel like I could have played that clip almost any week of any month of the past 10 months that, you know, there's progress, there's hope, we just need a little more. Meanwhile, we have protests at the front door of Bibi Netanyahu, 6 dead hostages found, and the Prime Minister of Israel saying, we're not going to move out of these key areas. How do you get to a ceasefire with these conditions?
You certainly don't get to a ceasefire with Bibi Netanyahu in place, reiterating that he's never leaving the Philadelphia corridor and that he wants to retain troops in Gaza. The protests are the most significant that have happened since pre-October 7, when the protests were trying to prevent a judicial coup by Bibi's government, but so far they're not enough. They're going to have to be sustained, and I just don't see progress. Even if the United States were to begin publicly criticizing Bibi, I don't see progress as long as he is in power.
Rhonda, how do you see it? I mean, we have seen President Biden saying that Bibi Netanyahu is not doing enough to get to a ceasefire, and which has prompted pushback, obviously, that they took our people and are killing our people, speaking about Hamas, and now you want us to be reasonable. Where do you see this right now?
I totally share John's perspective that as long as Mr. Netanyahu is the PM, Prime Minister, I don't see that a ceasefire deal is going to happen. And let's again stress again what's at issue here. The Philadelphia corridor is not a security decision as much as it is a political decision, because all members, especially of the security establishment, including the defense minister, the Israeli defense minister, are saying we can leave the Philadelphia corridor, we can return whenever we need to. And so it's not a military strategic decision. It's a political decision by the Israeli prime minister not wanting to get to a deal. Why? I think he knows, only he knows. And I don't see him paying much, to be very honest, much attention or much importance to what an American administration in its last 2-3 months is going to say.
John, do you think he's waiting to see what happens on the 5th of November with the U.S. election, Bibi Netanyahu? I mean, Biden is saying what Biden is saying, but, you know, he's not the Democratic nominee anymore. And we don't quite know where Kamala Harris is going to completely go on this, so she gave us a balanced indication of it in her speech at the Democratic National Convention. What do you think's in Bibi Netanyahu's mind here?
He's definitely hoping for a Trump victory. I think he'll try and prolong this as long as he can until November the 5th to see whether he gets that. There's no question that Kamala Harris will be tougher on him and potentially on Israel than Donald Trump would be, as unpredictable as Trump is, of course. But based on what he gave Israel during his administration, I think Bibi is betting on him. And that's extremely unfortunate. And he has dissed Biden in every possible way, despite the fact that the Americans have done more for this country in the last 10 months, 11 months since October 7 than one can imagine. With their aircraft carriers, their ammunition, their weapons, and their support throughout. And despite that, Bibi has given Biden and Harris no thanks whatsoever.
But you know, Rhonda, on the domestic Israeli politics, you have people like Defense Minister Gallant. They've been pushing for him to give up the quarter. And as you say, it's a political decision as opposed to a security decision. But the coalition that he leads does seem to be holding, even in the wake of the protests we saw there, because they're not necessarily from the right of the Israeli political spectrum and don't necessarily pose the threat to him that could cause his undoing. So how do you see his stability and security as prime minister right now?
I think it is, he doesn't face any serious challenge. I mean, there are two means of pressure that can be put on Mr. Netanyahu, and both of them have not yielded any kind of result. On one hand, whatever pressure is being put by the Biden administration behind closed doors, right? I mean, they keep saying they are putting some pressure. I don't think it's enough, and I don't think they are putting, the pressure that needs to be put. And then the pressure from the streets, from the Israeli public. And both of them have not yielded any kind of significant change in Mr. Netanyahu's position vis-a-vis a deal with Hamas.
Right. So John, Biden has said that he doesn't think they're doing enough. The United Kingdom has put pressure. Keir Starmer, his government, announcing that they're going to stop some arms exports to Israel. Canada has done something similar, though we don't really have a big arms supply with Israel in a meaningful way. Explain the dynamic to me that all the pressure seems to be on the democratically elected Israeli prime minister and not so much on the designated terrorist organization that launched the attacks, kidnapped people, and seemingly executed 6 more hostages or had them die in their custody over the weekend. Explain the way this is unfolding right now.
Well, you're absolutely right. We can't forget that this was all started on October 7. We can't forget that Hamas brutally killed 6 hostages on the weekend, 6 hostages, 4 of whom would have been in a deal if Bibi had allowed a deal. Look, the Forum of Hostage Families have essentially said, we know we can't rely on Sinwar and Hamas. They're not going to do anything for us. We have to rely on our own government to try and make a deal. And that's the horribly unfortunate situation that the hostage families are in, and frankly, that the Israeli people are in. Nobody is trying to give a bye to Hamas or Sinwar. The point here is that this war has to end. The generals have said that total victory is not possible. For the Palestinian people, for the Israeli people, to get back Israelis into their homes in the north and the south, to have Hezbollah stop firing, all of these things could happen. And you could then move to a potential deal with Saudi Arabia, etc., that all would be in Israel's benefit if only Bibi would agree to a ceasefire, get the hostages back, and move this forward. But he won't.
Rhonda, as a final point, we're a little over a month to October 7th, 2024, and the 1-year anniversary of this conflict, war, whatever you want to call it. Do you think there's a chance of a ceasefire between now and the 7th of October next month in the next little while, or is it's just so entrenched because of the dynamics we've been discussing that this just continues and persists?
Unfortunately, I see the chances for a ceasefire deal and the return of hostages to be quite slim, to be quite low. And partly because the two parties that are in this conflict, Mr. Netanyahu on one hand, and Sinwar on the other hand, have totally divergent positions, and totally divergent interests. They each seek to destroy the other side. They might come around a ceasefire deal, but again, I don't see that happening in the short term. And I totally agree with John, is that the decision today rests with the Israeli Prime Minister. Sinwar and Hamas have agreed to the conditions that were put forward by the Americans in July 2nd. There was a July 2nd deal. If Mr. Netanyahu agreed to it at the time, as John said, 4 of the young hostages would have been released then, and their lives would have been saved, of the 6 who were killed this past weekend. And so that's the unfortunate reality, is that the only decider right now about whether there will be a ceasefire deal or not is Mr. Netanyahu. And the others are going to come around once he agrees to it.
So John, just one last quick question. I mean, is there, Rhonda says he's not facing any kind of a meaningful challenge, this being Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. Is there an heir apparent, an alternative, a challenge? I mean, Benny Gantz, these others who have expressed frustration with what he's doing. Is there someone who could potentially change the dynamic in Israel?
Well, Gantz, I think, is not able to, and either is Yair Lapid, unfortunately. I think the only person, and the person that will likely succeed Netanyahu, is Naftali Bennett, who was the prime minister prior to Lapid. He is center-right. He is more trusted in many ways than Gantz now. Gantz is down in the polls. And I think what we have to hope for is either 4 or 5 members of the coalition finally seeing that this is hurting the Israeli people and society, or we see the demonstrations gaining in strength. Right. Finally, Israelis are saying, despite the war, we are prepared to go on the streets. They had been reluctant to do this up until last weekend. Maybe, just maybe, they've had enough, and they will shut down the country and force Bibi to resign.
Yeah, there's the great irony that the unions called for a general strike, and it was the courts that came to Bibi Netanyahu's defense on that one. It's good to talk to you both. I do look forward to these conversations ending at some point because of this conflict and the human catastrophe, but we always appreciate your insight. Rhonda Sleem, John Allen, thank you so much.